This is Mr. Oscar, and today we will talk about the deepest lever in all of execution psychology. Not habits, not systems, not environment design or implementation intentions or nervous system regulation. As important as all of those things are, and as much as I believe in every one of them, today we go underneath all of it. Because here is what I have come to understand after everything I have studied, everything I have lived through, and everything I have observed in the people I have worked with over 2 decades. Every sustainable behavioral change, every lasting shift in how a person executes, follows through, and shows up consistently, eventually traces back to one thing: a shift in how that person understands who they are, not what they do, not what systems they use, not what environment they have designed or what habits they have installed, but the story running in the background of every decision, every moment of resistance, and every morning when the alarm goes off and the question arrives, am I actually going to do this today? That story is your identity. And if it has not been updated, if it still carries the old definition of who you are, built from years of evidence that no longer needs to be true, then every system you build on top of it will eventually crack under the weight of a self-concept that does not yet include the person you are trying to become. You do not have a discipline problem, you have an identity problem, and today we are going to fix it from the inside out. I want to tell you about a specific conversation I had with myself in the winter of 2012. I was deep in the rebuilding process. I had enough distance from the collapse to be functional again. I had read enough, reflected enough, and restructured enough to have a reasonable plan for what came next. And I was sitting at my desk one morning, not avoiding the work exactly, but not doing it either, in that familiar suspended state where intention and action exist in the same moment without connecting, and I asked myself a question I had never quite asked that directly before. Who do I actually think I am? Not who do I want to be, not who am I trying to become. Who do I actually, at the level of felt belief, think I am right now? And the answer that came back, honest and uncomfortable, was something like this: I am someone who had a business and lost it. I am someone who knows what good execution looks like, but struggles to maintain it. I am someone who starts things with genuine conviction and watches them erode. I am someone who is trying to rebuild but is not yet sure if rebuilding is something people like me actually manage to do. That was my identity, not my aspiration, my actual operating self-concept. The story my nervous system was running every single day as the background instruction set for my behavior, and the behavior that story produced was completely predictable. Inconsistent execution, strong starts that faded, a pull toward preparation over action, a subtle but persistent sense that full commitment was somehow premature, because the person I currently believed myself to be had not yet earned the right to act with the confidence that full commitment would require. I was not lacking discipline. I was living out the behavioral implications of an identity that had been written by my worst chapter and never updated. The research that explains this most completely begins with the work of Dr. Dan McAdams at Northwestern University, one of the world's foremost authorities on narrative identity and its relationship to human behavior. McAdams spent decades studying how people construct their sense of self through personal narrative, the ongoing, largely unconscious story we tell about who we are, where we came from, and what we are capable of. His research showed that this self-narrative is not merely a description of behavior, it is a generator of it. The brain continuously produces behavior that is consistent with the dominant identity narrative, filtering experience, selecting evidence, and generating automatic responses that confirm and reinforce the existing story. What this means practically is devastating for anyone trying to change their behavior without first changing their self-narrative. You can install a new habit on top of an old identity. For a while, it will hold. The novelty provides enough energy, the external structure provides enough scaffolding, and the initial results provide enough reinforcement to sustain the behavior through the early weeks. But when the novelty fades and the results slow and the resistance rises, the old identity narrative reasserts itself. Because the behavior was never truly consistent with who the person believed themselves to be, and the brain, running its narrative confirmation function, quietly redirects behavior back toward consistency with the existing story. This is why you have broken the same habit multiple times, not because the habit was wrong, because the identity generating the behavior was never updated. James Clear articulated this insight with extraordinary clarity in Atomic Habits when he argued that the most effective and durable form of behavior change is identity-based rather than outcome-based. Clear's synthesis of the behavioral research shows that people who change their identity first, who begin to genuinely see themselves as a different kind of person, produce behavior change that sustains itself because it is now simply an expression of who they are rather than an effortful deviation from it. The person who says, "I am trying to exercise more," is fighting their identity every time they lace up their shoes. The person who says, "I am someone who moves their body every day," is simply acting like themselves. Same behavior, completely different relationship with the friction of doing it. But here is what most discussions of identity-based habit change miss, and what I think is the most important layer of this entire conversation. The identity does not change because you decide it should. It does not change because you write a new affirmation, or adopt a new label, or tell yourself a different story in the mirror on a Tuesday morning. The identity changes because of evidence. Specifically, because of accumulated behavioral evidence that makes the new story more credible to your own nervous system than the old one. This is where the research of Dr. Amy Cuddy at Harvard Business School becomes critical. Cuddy's work on behavioral self-perception, building on the earlier research of social psychologist Daryl Bem, demonstrated that the relationship between identity and behavior runs in both directions simultaneously. We behave in accordance with who we believe we are, and we come to believe we are who we repeatedly behave like. The behavior shapes the identity as much as the identity shapes the behavior, which means you do not have to wait until you fully believe the new identity before you begin acting from it. You can begin producing the behavioral evidence that makes the new identity increasingly credible, one small action at a time, until the weight of evidence tips, until the new story has more supporting data than the old one, and the identity genuinely shifts. Cuddy calls this the fake it till you become it principle. Not performance, not pretense. The deliberate use of identity-consistent behavior to produce the neural and psychological updates that make the identity real. There is also deeply important research here from Dr. Tara Brach, the clinical psychologist and mindfulness researcher whose work on what she calls the trance of unworthiness addresses something that sits underneath most identity problems I have ever observed in people who struggle to execute. Brach found in her clinical research that a significant proportion of people who chronically underperform relative to their own capacity are operating inside a deeply conditioned belief, often formed in early experience, often entirely outside conscious awareness, that they are not quite enough, not quite capable enough, not quite deserving enough, not quite the kind of person who gets to have the outcomes they are reaching for. This belief, which Brach identifies as so pervasive in modern adults that she describes it as a near-universal condition, does not announce itself as a belief. It announces itself as behavior, as the chronic hesitation before commitment, as the subtle self-sabotage at the edge of breakthrough, as the persistent gap between knowing and doing that no amount of external system building ever fully closes. Because you cannot build a consistent execution identity on a foundation that secretly believes the execution is not for people like you. And addressing that foundation requires something more than habit stacking or implementation intentions. It requires what Brach calls a direct, honest, compassionate examination of the story underneath the behavior. The question, what do I actually believe about whether I deserve the outcome I am working toward, is one of the most important execution questions available. And it is almost never asked. Here is the practical framework. 3 components that work together to produce genuine identity-level change rather than behavioral change that sits on top of an unchanged identity. The first component is identity excavation. Before you can update the identity you have to see it clearly, and most people have never looked at it directly, take out something to write on. Write the answer to this question as honestly as you can manage. When I imagine myself executing consistently, showing up every day, finishing what I start, building the thing I keep saying I am going to build, what is the quiet voice underneath that image saying about whether that is really for someone like me? Write the actual answer, not the aspirational version, the felt one. The one that has been running in the background while you have been trying to fix the surface behavior. That answer is your current identity, the one that has been generating the behavior you want to change. You cannot update what you cannot see. And most people spend their entire lives trying to change behavior that is being generated by an identity they have never once looked at directly. The second component is minimum viable identity evidence, drawing from Cuddy's behavioral self-perception research and Clear's identity-based habit framework. Your task is to identify the single smallest action that a person who already held your desired identity would do today. Not the full behavior, not the complete execution system, the one rep, the one action that is identity consistent at the most basic possible level. And when you complete it, this is critical, you do not simply move on, You file it explicitly as identity evidence. You say, out loud or in writing, that is what someone who executes consistently does. I just did that. That is who I am being right now. You are not celebrating the action. You are updating the narrative database. You are producing the evidence that McAdams' research shows is the actual mechanism of identity change. One filed piece of evidence at a time. The third component addresses Brock's unworthiness layer directly. It is a daily written practice that takes 3 minutes and operates at a level underneath habit and system. Every morning before you begin work, write one sentence that completes this statement honestly. Today, I am choosing to act like someone who deserves the outcome I am building toward. Even though part of me still believes that person is not quite who I am yet. That sentence does two things simultaneously. It acknowledges the gap, the distance between the current identity and the desired one, without pretending it doesn't exist. And it makes a deliberate, explicit daily choice to act from the desired identity rather than waiting until the identity has fully arrived before the acting begins, because the identity never fully arrives before the acting begins. The acting is what brings it. 3 components. Excavate the current identity. Produce minimum viable evidence for the new one. Choose daily to act from the desired identity before it feels completely true. That is the framework. Simple in structure, genuinely difficult in execution, and more powerful than any habit system built on top of an identity that was never updated. I want to close with something I have been sitting with for a long time. The years I spent trying to fix my execution through systems, habits, and discipline, without ever looking honestly at the identity generating the behavior, were not wasted years. Every framework I learned had value. Every system I built taught me something. But none of it fully held until the identity shifted, until I stopped being, at the level of felt belief, someone who had failed and was trying to rebuild, and started being someone who executes, not perfectly, not without resistance, but consistently. As a function of who I understood myself to be rather than how I felt on any given morning. That shift did not happen in a dramatic moment. It happened through the slow accumulation of filed evidence. Small actions completed, small promises kept, small moments of identity-consistent behavior that individually meant almost nothing and collectively rewrote the story. You do not need more discipline. You need a different story and the behavioral evidence to make it true. Start producing the evidence today. One action, filed deliberately. As proof of who you are becoming, the identity follows the evidence. It always has. I'm Mr. Oscar. This is Execution Psychology, and I will see you in the next one.